Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
A couple months ago, after our profiler training live event, Antonia and I mean, it's a very challenging event to do, 5 days, and we had an extra bonus day of 6 days of energy, activity, teaching. We took a day in California and just spent the day chilling out and relaxing a little bit before we had to fly home and get back to our normal lives. And we went to Venice Beach, the Santa Monica Venice Beach area in California in Los Angeles, and we just walked up and down the beach all day and talked and reflected on the great event that we had just come from and all the different people we got to connect with. It's a really neat afterglow experience after a live event to do that. And during the time, I'm like in flow, right? And I think Antonia is as well. When you do a live event, you teach, you feel so good and things feel like everything's just working out for you. So we're in this really great space. We're high from an amazing event. We're in the California sun, and we wander into an Egyptian oil and crystal shop on the Venice. I don't know if it's called a boardwalk. What's it called there in Venice?
I don't know. Did they call it the boardwalk? I don't know.
I know there's a pier, but I don't know what they call the other one going along the coast.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a boardwalk on the East Coast. So I'll call it a boardwalk. We walk in the shop, and we're looking at some of the oils and things they have in the shop, and a gentleman comes over and starts striking up a conversation with us, the gentleman that works at the shop. His name was Etev. And we were talking to him probably for two and a half hours about essential oils. And we found out he's from Egypt. He's an Egyptian man that works in California 3 to 6 months out of the year and then flies back home, back to Egypt. And he told us he was getting ready to go to Egypt for a 2 or 3 month break from being in the United States and working. And he said, you know what? You guys should come to Egypt and visit me. And this is after, again, 2.5 hours of conversation, but we had just met this guy. And the two of us looked at each other. We were vibing with him pretty hard, and some of the conversation we had was really good. And we said, okay, let's get your contact information. And then within 2 months, we went to Egypt to visit him, just on a whim, like 2 ENPs would in the Myers-Briggs system, right?
So I think the thing that sealed the deal, though, is he said, you should come visit me, and I'll take you out to the White Desert to meditate. And that was, I think, what sealed it. Because going to Egypt has been something I've wanted to do my entire life. And it wouldn't have taken much convincing to get me out there. But I think having a man who lived, who's native to there, encouraging us to go travel, not just to visit all of the major, the sites, but also to go to a place called the White Desert for a meditation trip. I was like, yeah, I think I could get on board with that. And what I think why it became something that we were able to negotiate so quickly is because we were already thinking about going to India. We were starting to plan a trip to India, and we were getting our passports and I had my passport. You had to get yours renewed. And we were sort of gathering everything we would need for international travel, and we just redirected our attention away from India and now put it onto Egypt. So it was easy to do that since we were already on a trajectory of international travel. But it was very quick. It was like within two months. And then we found ourselves in Egypt. And he connected us with a family member that runs a travel agency. And so we were able to also go through a travel agency, which if you're considering going to Egypt, go through a travel agency. Like actually have a tour guide go with you because it will grease the wheels of absolutely everything. And we went with a place called Fayed Travel, which we really highly recommend because they were phenomenal. So we found ourselves in Egypt, and it was now in retrospect, I realize a whirlwind trip. I mean, we were up super early every day to get as much of the country, like to explore as much of it as we possibly could. And we went all over the place.
Yeah, it was, like you said, it was a whirlwind tour to the point where, I mean, if you're a judger listening right now, you probably won't be surprised as perceivers. We didn't really look up much before we left. Like, I don't think I really knew what the White Desert was. I didn't do any research. I just trusted that this was all going to work out. Yeah. And we're going to end up in the desert somewhere in Egypt, and we're going to be alive, and it's going to be awesome. And like, I just kind of trust, it's weird, but I just trusted that it's all going to be okay. And it was awesome. It was an incredible journey.
Yeah, we were going to be fine, right? And It ended up, and we ended up being fine. So that's good.
Yeah. And it is credited to having a guide, like you mentioned, which I didn't realize. I think in the West, here in the United States, at least, we're used to booking things online and figuring out travel ourselves and renting cars and, even in international travel in some places. But it was really nice to have somebody help guide you and explain the different elements of the cultural things you're seeing and help you with the language. Obviously, I don't speak Arabic and neither do you. So it was wonderful to have people helping. But we, like you said, we went everywhere. We started day one, we saw the Great Pyramids of Giza. Then we flew to Aswan and we got on a cruise down the Nile River to Luxor, stopping at different towns along the way, seeing temples, built by the Egyptians and the Greeks when Alexander the Great had come through Egypt. We ended up in Luxor. We went to the Valley of the Kings. We saw tombs. We saw the Karnak temple and the Luxor temple. Flew from Luxor back to Cairo. We saw so many things in Cairo. Went to the White Desert to meditate. We went to Alexandria. It was just and it was like every day we're up on itineraries that are just running us on a very fast pace. But we got to see so much of the country. It was such a rich experience, and it brings things alive that I've been reading about. In my faith background, I've been reading about Egypt in the Bible since I was a little kid, like before I could even read myself. My parents were reading me stories. So some of the things I had read about just came alive experientially by traveling to this country, this place that I'd heard so much about. And, culturally, it's in our imagination a lot too as people. So it was a fantastic experience.
And I think because we decided to go by being invited by locals, we were also able to engage with like the city of Cairo and the city of Giza a little bit more personally. Like we got invited over to people's houses for dinner, and we were able, like the two places that we went were at very different sides of the socioeconomic scale. So we were able to eat dinner at the house of somebody who had quite a bit of money. And we were also able to eat dinner at the house of somebody who was a little bit struggling. And we got to see sort of a real experience, I think, as close as we could get as people who were clearly Westerners, an experience of what it means to live in this mega city. Cairo's a mega city. There's like 25 million people, which blows my mind. It really blows my mind. And it's a place of chaos, honestly. I don't know how people drive in it. The first day, I was terrified. I mean, nobody buckles up. Every time I asked somebody if they're going to use their seatbelt, they were like, "Oh, Allah will protect me." And I'm like, man, I hope Allah's got some pretty good restraint there or ability to restrain your body, because we're going like 50 miles an hour, and I'm pretty sure everybody's playing Frogger and Chicken across these freeways, like on foot. And I just hope nobody dies. And what's crazy is that there were very few accidents. I was surprised by how few people get into accidents considering the chaos of the driving situation. In fact, you and I both hearken back to in our INTX Unleashed program, our friend Brent Brewer in an interview said as an INTJ, he looks around the world and he's like, what is this chaos? And he's saying that as somebody who lives in Canada. When we were in Cairo,
like out in the kind of not countryside, but a smaller area, smaller town in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And I've never understood what that really meant. Like as an INTJ, how do you look around and say, what is this chaos? Because it doesn't seem very chaotic to me. And then I went to Cairo and I looked around. I'm like, what is this chaos? So I got to experience the world as an INTJ for a couple days. By the time we left, I had acclimated enough to know that it was probably going to be fine, because the people weren't losing their lives every 10 minutes like I was anticipating or expecting. And there's this sense that you just get to invent lanes, and you get to invent your own traffic laws in order to get around. And everybody's doing that, and yet they're very accommodating for each other. As opposed to being filled with road rage, they're all very zen about the whole thing. So not a lot of accidents happened. I think the one accident we saw, everybody stopped and went and attended to, the people who were in the accident. So they're also very concerned if there's anything bad that happens. Just a very different culture than what we're used to. And there were some heartbreaking things we saw. Like we drove around the city and along the canals. Some of the canals were quite polluted. Saw a little kid, probably about the age of 8 or 9, picking through garbage looking for food. And it really reflected back to me the blessings that we have, like you and me specifically, but also being in the West. We're extremely blessed for the most part that I was told by someone that Egypt has debtor's prison. And so if you go into debt at all for any reason, I mean, just like if you buy a bicycle and you go into debt, they can throw you in prison for having been in debt and not being able to pay off your debts. So if you're in a bad financial situation, it's very difficult to get any sort of capital to get yourself out of that situation. So when people are at a very low socioeconomic level, it's really very difficult to navigate out of that situation. Whereas in the West, there are a lot of opportunities to, if you can figure it out, there are ways to negotiate and leverage and sort of parlay different opportunities to get to a different place. And it's easy to criticize our society. In fact, I think we're in a time period of a lot of putting our society under a magnifying glass and looking for all the ways in which it's broken and not working. So because we're in a climate of doing that constantly, it's hard to remember just how good we have it. It's easy to get on the bandwagon of saying that everything is bad and wrong and we should change everything. And there are things that need to be changed. As a perpetually evolving species, we should always try to be getting better and doing everything we can to get better. And I think something that we don't do enough of is be grateful for where we've come, like the opportunities and the blessings that we really have here. So, watching little kids living basically in garbage in order to sustain themselves and then coming home to a much more effective society, ultimately. Like, this is more effective for everyone. I think it gave me a little bit of perspective. It gave me some perspective on we're doing some things right, and we should remember the things we're doing right and be very grateful that we're so blessed to be in a place that does a lot right.
I think international travel helps anyone from any country see cultures and differences from what it's like at home, because as humans, we tend to acclimate to whatever our environment is, and we zoom way in on that environment, and we see all the distinctions and the nuance of maybe what we don't like or what we do like. And when you travel to some place that's radically different than what you're used to, it really opens your eyes and gets you to see things fresh and new again, which is really unique. And I love the fact I'm trying to think through my travels. I think when I say this is accurate. This is the first non-Latin influenced culture or country I've ever been to outside the United States. I've been to Brazil in South America and multiple European countries and many Caribbean countries, but they all have like Western language roots, like Portuguese or Spanish or German or whatever. And so there's a familiarity there. And in Cairo, obviously, the language is Arabic, and it's a Middle Eastern country. And so it's very Oriental in its focus and the way it shows up. And it was a very unique experience for me to be in such a different culture holistically that really shone a light on the things that I take for granted or I don't really think about every day because it's just not in my experience. So I think it's a benefit if you can travel to a place that's got such a drastic difference than what you're used to. This really opens your eyes to a lot of things.
Yeah. So some of the major takeaways were, first of all, it's like hard to compute in your brain the significance of being in a space that is a representation from our earliest civilization, a known civilization in this part. It's the earliest known civilization. Some of the buildings we're walking through are like the earliest like major monuments that we have that predate almost everything else we have by like a couple thousand years. And so we were able to, of course, we visited the pyramids, and the pyramids they're as impressive as you think they would be. They really are. Like I'm used to going and visiting things and being a little underwhelmed by them. Like the hype is more than the experience. But I don't think that was the case for the pyramids. They really are ridiculously spectacular. And you can go in. You can get an extra ticket that allows you to go in and walk up the very narrow and very small, like sort of cavernous hallways to get up to the center of the pyramid where the sarcophagus would have been. And it's not a lot of fresh air in there. It's very warm and hot. It's like a kind of an oppressive environment, but the energy is very intense. It's like kind of got a throbbing energy that even somebody like me, who doesn't usually experience energy, not like you do, Joel, you experience energy way more intensely than I do. And I don't usually experience it. And even I was able to get a feel for the energy of the place.
It was a significant feeling when you're there. There's something special of the location I'm in. Whether you feel visceral energy in your body or not as a person, I think there is a significance to being in a structure that's, I think, the oldest structure on the planet. It's like almost 5,000 years old. And it is a very unique experience being in that structure. And around, the Sphinx is right there. And it's interesting to see how close the city of Giza is to all of this. Like, there's buildings right up very close to the pyramids. And so you kind of have this city around you, and you would think it's out in the middle of nowhere, the pyramids, but they're really not. Giza is right up against them, and it's almost swarming around the side of it too now. The population of Cairo and Giza is exploding. And so there's new building happening all the time. So you can see the city is starting to expand out and swarm out around the pyramids. And I think the Egyptian government's doing a really good job right now of preserving them and keeping them sacred as a space for people all over the world to continue to visit on a regular basis.
Yeah, pretty soon it's going to be in the center of the city. It won't be on the outskirts. Like, with the population explosion, I think it's pretty clear that they're going to end up wrapping around it. It's a really interesting time to go visit it right now, by the way. The politics of Egypt is that after 2011's revolution with the Arab Spring, it actually was very devastating to Egyptian tourism, particularly for people in the UK and in America. And the American money and British money has been a big part of the tourism for Egypt for a long time. So when it ended up being that Americans and people in the UK thought that it was a dangerous place, the tourism fundamentally dried up, and it was devastating to their economy. The person who we were spending the most time with, his name was Hassan, and he talked about how they just started to recover around 2016-ish. And now it's starting to amp back up a little bit, but it's one of those slow and steady things. So right now it's like a kind of a reasonable time to go because it's not completely overwhelmed and overcrowded. And they're so grateful that you're there. Like, they were so grateful that Americans were there. And they're like, tell everybody to come visit us. Tell them it's not unsafe. And what was crazy is when we were about to go, everybody told us to be safe. They're like, are you sure it's safe to go? And I was like, I think it's probably going to be okay. And everybody was really worried about us. But when we came back, we're like, nope, that's pretty safe. That's a very, and they're very protective of their tourists because tourism is a part of their culture to a point where there's like tourism graduate school. Like, there's an entire degree you get in being a tour guide because you have to like learn Egyptology and all sorts of stuff and like the financial component of it. So it is really woven into their culture. And that means that they're going to treat tourists differently than other, sort of Arabic countries probably would, because Egypt they're sitting on a gold mine of historical significance. So they to some extent they understand that. And so they just won't let you go into a place that isn't safe. There's like a city right now that isn't considered safe for Westerners. They won't even let you go on the road to get there. It used to be that they would do long Nile River cruises from Aswan all the way up to Cairo, which is like a 5 to 7 day trip. They won't let you do that anymore. They only let you go from Aswan to Luxor because there are certain towns between Luxor and Cairo that aren't considered safe for Americans, or for Westerners rather, Europeans, Westerners, etc. And so they won't let you go to the dangerous places, which means that everywhere that you go is pretty much relatively safe. I mean, it's still international travel. You still have to be vigilant. You have to do all the stuff you should be doing. But it's actually, I would recommend going right now.
So after we saw the pyramids, we went on that cruise you were talking about through the Nile River, and we hit some of the temples along the way. And I found these to be incredibly fascinating. Went to Philae Temple in Aswan. We went to a temple in Edfu. I can't remember the name of that one. And then we got to Luxor and went to the Karnak and Luxor temples. And the Karnak temple, it's like it took 1,300 years to build it. And the immensity of this temple is off the charts. It's to the god Amun-Ra, and there's, I think, a secondary side temple to Sekhmet. And the power and energy and the attention to this thing it's hard to describe. I mean, you walk in, the columns are enormous. You literally feel like there should be this swelling soundtrack of John Williams music or something as you're walking into this temple because it's so immense. I think it's one of the standing 7 wonders of the ancient world, right?
No, I think the pyramid is the only wonder of the ancient world that still exists. But I want to say I heard somebody say that the Karnak temple is one of the modern wonders of the world.
Gotcha. And so just the age of this and the time it took, it is impressive to me that over 1,300 years, the vision of building this remained intact with the people of Egypt and the pharaohs that came and went over 1,300 years, that they continued working on this during that entire time period. Like that was just that alone impressed this ENFP's, extroverted thinking and introverted sensing in the backseat of my car model. I'm just like, how do you even sustain that much of energy and intention of building a structure like that for over 1,000 years?
Yeah, well, it's an attention span that like marks multiple generations. And that's really impressive to us because we don't have an attention span that seems to last for, like a week.
Yeah, well, I was on the Dario Nardi video the other day, the ENFP one on our channel, and somebody said, ENFPs can't watch a 2-hour video? This is impossible. Like, I can only watch like 10 minutes and I've got to go do something else. And I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah, it's maybe an epidemic of the lack of attention span that we have.
So I see that comment while I'm in Egypt, right? In the Karnak temple that took 1,300 years, and I'm just looking at this juxtaposition between these two pieces of information. It's like blowing my mind.
Well, and I think that's a lesson that Egypt gives us. I mean, obviously, we're talking about our trip to Egypt, and it probably just sounds like a basic travel podcast. But the reality is that we got a lot of lessons from this trip. And that's like us. Like, we are both ENPs, and extroverted intuition or exploration is our dominant driver function. And a lot of what we understand about the world comes through adventure and exploration and travel. So we're still post-processing. We're just still doing a lot of introverted sensing or memory post-processing of the experience and getting more and more lessons from it. But like I mentioned earlier, it's a moment that burns in your brain when you see a kid picking food out of trash. And it's also something that burns in your brain when you're looking at a temple that took over 1,000 years to construct. And the amount of attention and intention and respect and honor and sacredness that the place ended up representing to, like you mentioned, all these different pharaonic dynasties. Again, it's like hard for the mind to compute the significance of that. Like it takes a while to really have it sink in. And particularly in the modern world where we, in my opinion, not just the modern world, specifically Western world, specifically those of us in America, I would say we are the worst offenders of disregarding the importance of history. We don't have a lot of history, we do have quite a bit of history, but it's very new history in the United States. And all of our ancient history comes from indigenous tribes, like the Native Americans. And there's not a lot of that because a lot of it was wiped away. So the long-standing history that we would have here is sparse because of the destruction of a lot of those indigenous peoples and the things that they would have left behind. And then when you've got the modern day America, the melting pot that we currently live in, like the history doesn't chart back for much more than a couple hundred years, a few hundred years, really, if you're looking at like early settlers. And so we take history for granted. We really do. Like I've talked about it in the podcast before, but it kind of turns my stomach, honestly, how little we see the significance of history and how easy it is for us to ignore it. Young people have a tendency to believe that they conflate, like we've talked about the DIKW in the past, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. I think we've done entire podcasts on it. And I think particularly young people conflate data and information with knowledge and wisdom. They don't know that knowledge and wisdom is something that can only be culled over time. It's something that requires time, and particularly long stretches of time, in order to amalgamate data and information into knowledge and wisdom. And so since all of us have tiny little devices that are the sizes of old calculators in the back pocket, where we can pull up Google at any moment and get access to data and information at any time, we are spoiled with our data and information, and it causes us to massively undervalue the importance of knowledge and wisdom. And history is one of the easiest ways to leverage the knowledge and wisdom from others into something that we can understand so that we don't have to keep making the same mistakes. And I think what I loved about Egypt was being at the place of the oldest knowledge and wisdom. I mean, we still don't know how they made those pyramids. We still don't know. There are really interesting theories about how it happened, but they're just theories. The geometry of the place, the architecture of those places, like, they shouldn't exist. So there's knowledge there and wisdom there that we're still trying to really process and figure out in the modern world. It's easy to diminish the importance of history, but I think that impressing upon people, like really impressing upon people the importance of history and to fall in love with it, I think Egypt gave me a renewed vigor for doing that.
Well, I think the data and information also is custom tailored. In other words, you can find data and information for any belief you want to reinforce with a Google search. Like, you can find somebody saying, like, this is the data and information to back up that belief you have. And so I think when you get a sense of visceral history, you visit a temple that's, 4,000 years old, or a pyramid that's almost 5,000 years old, and you're in a place, there's a sense of physicality and understanding that is beyond articulation or being able to read something or the data and information. There's an embodied experience there. There's information there that can't be articulated from one brain to another. It has to be experienced, being in that physical place, because it's a sense of like this. It's nonverbal information, quite frankly. It's energetic information, and it's historical information that's energetically stored. That sounds really kind of woo-woo maybe, but there's something about that happens when you go to a place and you experience stuff. There was an interesting experience. We were at the one temple, I think it was in Edfu, where it used to be, I can't remember the name of it, but it used to be a medical facility during the Greek times. They used this temple to have doctors and medical, or maybe this was a different one. I don't remember. Actually, this was a different temple. This might have been the Luxor temple we were at, where they had a carving on the wall of an erect penis, and there was sperm dripping out of it. And then next to it, there was like a cup collecting it or something like this. And next to it was the actual carving of a sperm into the wall. And it's like, how did they know what a sperm looked like years like before microscopes or any kind of instruments were invented to see something like that? Like, how did they have knowledge to put that into a carving thousands of years ago before any modern science was here?
Yeah, it kind of wigged me out, actually. I was like, because like you said, there was a cup of semen and then there was the specific sperm.
Yeah.
Maybe our audience, you, the listener, if you know how ancient Egyptians knew what specific sperm looked like, please let us know, because it is a total mystery to us.
Yeah, and they still don't know why that was carved there and who did it and how they knew. They don't know how they had certain medical instruments they had carved in the side they were using. The mummification process, people have tried to duplicate it for thousands of years, and no one has seemed to be able to replicate it in the way the Egyptians had done it. I think the Greeks even tried it, a long time ago, because we went and saw some catacombs in Alexandria where they had tried the embalming experience to kind of replicate what the Egyptians had done, and they couldn't do it as well as the Egyptians had done it.
Not embalming, mummifying.
Mummifying, excuse me, yeah.
Yeah, well, the modern world, we embalm, and that's as close to mummification as we get. But I don't think embalming lasts for thousands upon thousands of years.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't think that our bodies through embalming will last for 5,000 years, like the mummification process did.
So this is interesting. They have this information that when you're there, you get a sense of there must be a way that information is communicated beyond what we in the West have come to know of, like reading a book or understanding through verbal or written, information or a microscope or a scientific instrument that measures these things. There's other capturing and transmission of information that must have been happening in the ancient world that maybe we've lost the ability for at this point, or some sense of something, intuitive sense of how things work that we were more tapped into at a time as humanity in the past that we've lost a sense of now.
Yeah. And it makes me think, the whole concept that like time is not linear. And there's a collective unconscious that we all have access to, and all of the information of the universe is in the collective unconscious. And if time isn't linear, there might be pieces of information that were available simply because the collective unconscious has information from all of the different time periods that can be tapped into. That's about as woo-woo as I get. I mean, like, that's my favorite brand of woo. My favorite brand of woo is talking about the collective unconscious and the information that we can pull from it at various time periods in history, including the past pulling from future time periods. And one of the things that hit me or struck me at a certain point was, how do you get an on-ramp to that collective unconscious? How do you access it in a way that people like access information on Google? Something that I've been thinking about a lot since I got back. But regardless of the answer to that mystery, it is something that when you experience walking through some of these places, these temples, etc. And I think the reason why you can't remember the Edfu temple is because they call it the Edfu temple. I think it's named after the town it's right by.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
So that's where you're like, I can't remember the name of that one. I think it's called the Edfu temple. And like you mentioned, there's an energy, there's like energetic information that's found there. Something that is hard to articulate or encapsulate in any other way, but simply walking through, like moving through. I think that there's also power to moving through a space, not just passively experiencing it, not watching it on a screen, not like sort of sitting and leaning back and having this information be transmitted to you in like moving pictures or whatever, but actually physically being in a space and moving and walking through it. I think that there's information that can only be understood in this sensation of moving through. I'm not really sure what it is. I don't understand it, and I just accept it because I experienced the difference. So the trip up the Nile, hitting those temples, gave us a lot of that kind of information, energetic information. Also, like you mentioned, we were in a place that was like, these are the locations of a lot of the stories that I heard as a child. And so it was really neat to be able to, just actually be at the place of the stories of my childhood and see, like the reeds that Moses was put into as a baby, like the reeds of the Nile River. There are reeds right there. It could have been something very similar to that. So that was really neat as well. And of course, it's just beautiful. It's just spectacularly beautiful. We went down, we took a smaller boat off of the cruise boat to a little Nubian village and walked through. And the Nubian village I kind of likened it in my mind to like going to an Amish village here in Pennsylvania, where it's sort of stepping back in time, even for them. Like the Nubians are, they're a little off the grid and they're different. Like they're sort of a branch off that's different than the rest of Egyptians in both culture and in like some, like the places that they're originally from. I think that they're more originally from sub-Saharan Africa, whereas places in Cairo and the people groups there are more sort of Arabic in their ancestry. So it was cool going to the Nubian village and just watching how a very remote people group still lives as almost a throwback from history. So that was really neat as well. And then we took the Nile River up to Luxor, and then we flew back to Cairo. And then from there, we went on our meditation trip to the White Desert.
And again, the White Desert was, we really didn't know what we were getting into. We had no idea, but we ended up getting in a car and driving 4 or 5 hours west of Cairo into basically the middle of nowhere. And when you're driving, it's not like you're driving through villages or towns or anything. You're literally driving across one of the most desolate places I've ever been in my life.
Was the Sahara?
Yeah, it's the Sahara Desert, and it's like the sand is blown over the road. There's like 1 or 2 stops on the entire journey, like a rest stop. And besides that, there's no vegetation, there's no people. There's like a set of train tracks every once in a while, and that's literally it. Like there's nothing. It looks like you'd think like it's a surface of Mars out there.
Yeah, there's like a mosque every once in a while and a military outpost every once in a while. But other than the mosques, the military outposts, and a bunch of sand, that was pretty much it.
Yeah. So we get out to this oasis way west of Cairo, and we stay at a retreat center, which is really cool. There's a gentleman there that had built this as a place for people to come and get away from, civilization, I guess, basically, and be out in the desert. And then from this facility, they take trips in land cruisers out into the White Desert for spending the night in the White Desert. So we loaded up. We spent one night at the retreat center, and then we got into this land cruiser, and we drove like 50, 60 miles an hour over top of sand dunes, Sahara sand dunes, west, another hour and a half, 2 hours through the Black Desert, past the Crystal Mountain, into the White Desert, and then we camped in the White Desert on the sand in the most remote place I've ever been in my entire life.
Yeah, the word that came to me the most was desolate. It was just desolate. There was nothing there except these. It's like these little piles like appear to be made of chalk, and by little piles I mean like very large hill-sized, sort of these chalky sort of substance
formations. Yeah,
and they ended up being sculpted by the wind over who knows how long, hundreds of thousands of years. And so they all look like sculptures. It looks like you're in a forest of sculptures that you can climb on, and they're really cool. And some of them, I mean, it's almost like looking at shapes in the clouds. There's certain shapes that look like rabbits, and some that look like chickens, and some that look like people, and one looked like a camel, and it's like really neat. But it's a forest of this and nothing else. We saw tracks in the sand of small critters. Like there's animals out there, but I think other than just one tiny little mouse, I don't think we saw any animals out there the entire time we were there, because they're all hiding and under the ground and stuff. And I don't know what they're eating. I have no idea what they're eating. I mean, I'm sure National Geographic would tell us, but it's amazing what they live on, the little that they live on. And we were able to meditate while the sun went down, and we were able to meditate. We got up early and meditated while the sun was rising. And it was just maybe one of the most precious moments of my life. I'm not sure how else to say it. It's being out in the middle of nowhere, like you're on the moon, and getting a taste of your relative insignificance. Just recognizing that there is an enormous universe out here that doesn't know, it doesn't know my name. It doesn't know that I'm here. It doesn't really care. And the footprints that I'm making on the sand are going to be gone within a couple hours from the wind anyway. So it was really punctuated by a perspective of my insignificance in the universe that I think was actually quite healthy for me. It was like really good for me to get that perspective, because I came away changed, I think.
At night, the sky is like a windshield of a spaceship flying through the stars. And you feel like you're just watching out the front of a windshield, like you're just flying through space, and the stars are so brilliant and bright. There are no lights anywhere. So the Milky Way is lit up, and you can just see. It's actually hard to see constellations because so many other stars are visible that, back home here, there's so much light pollution, the constellations almost stand out more. But there, they were blended in with so many other stars. You had to really concentrate to pick out constellations that back home I'm used to being able to see easier. So it was really an interesting experience on that regard too.
Yeah, like having a whole night full of fiber optic lights or something. It was really intense. And I think what I appreciated about the situation was that it's really easy to overvalue our relative importance. Like this is my life. This is the life that I'm living. I feel pain and pleasure, and I want to maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. And there are people who love me, and I love them, and we have an impact on each other. So I'm not trying to indicate that there's like literally zero meaning to my life or zero significance to my life. There is meaning and significance but it's a game that I'm playing. And when my candle is snuffed out, that it will be complete. And other than the impact that I have on other people and whatever impact I have on the games they're playing, all like the pinprick of impact that we make in the universe is immeasurably small, like as an individual and as a species and as a rock in the enormity of the universe. And considering that it's so easy for us to overinflate our relative importance as individuals and as a species or as a culture or a society or whatever, to look at everything around us and believe that all of this is real and this is the most important, whatever it is the most important thing that could possibly be happening, whatever that it is for me in my life. It was good to get a moment of going, actually, no, it's not. Like whatever it is also going to be washed over through the winds, like whatever footprint that thing is making through the sands of time, it's also going to be gone very quickly through the wind, because nothing really is permanent. So cool your tits. All right, that's the message I got from the White Desert, was no matter what I'm anxious about or whatever is going on for me, I probably should cool my tits, and it's probably going to be fine. So I came back with a very humbled perspective of my place in the universe.
I felt that way in Cairo too. I felt that way in the White Desert and Cairo because you feel insignificant for different reasons. In the White Desert, it's this lonely feeling. The silence is loud. That's how silent it is. It's almost a ringing. It's so loud. And then Cairo is also loud, like actually loud. And there's over 20 million people. And I've been to Rio in Brazil, but I was only in the airport just for a few hours. So I've never actually been in a city over 20 million people before, and actually been out and among the city and just see how a mega city operates and how fast it's growing and all of the challenges that it is facing now and will be facing in the future became very real to me. And I can't speak enough about both experiences. If you're listening, to get to a place that's desolate with no one else around can be a powerful experience. And also getting to a megacity with everybody around can also be powerful, because you see almost your insignificance on two polar extremes. At least it was for me. And how much effort I would put into anything. Let's say I wanted to, help Cairo in some way as a person, like the insignificance of one person's involvement in a city that size, it just seems insurmountable. And so these are perspectives I came back with, just kind of realizing how small and how big the world is at the same time, which is kind of a weird experience. But it felt both extremely small and overwhelmingly large in the same moments.
Yeah, I think we have a conceit where we think we're going to be able to save the world. Like, and by we, I mean like me and a lot of people that I know. In fact, everybody. And unless you've gotten to sort of a philosophical Zen place where you're like, nobody can really save the world. I think there's a conceit that we have all of this ability and this power and influence. I think, too, that we get a lot of messaging that we're, as an individual, it's my responsibility to, quote unquote, do my part and to save the planet or whatever. The messaging from parents started getting pretty intense when you and I were probably in high school. And so I think kids that are younger than us, old millennials all the way down to now the kids who are in school, we get hammered with these messages, and they've gotten hammered with these messages that it's their job to save the world. And there's really, there's nobody who can save the world, right? There's nobody who can save the planet. There are collective efforts that can help, and no individual person is going to be the person who saves the world, which is it's sort of interesting to think about, because yours and my podcast, Joel, is predicated on this idea of inspiring people to do better, or to be the best version of themselves and to leave their impact and their voice. So, I come away from experiences like that with sort of weighing these two sides, which is I don't really believe that any single individual is going to be able to have the capacity to alter mankind. And also, I feel it's important to inspire people to do their best. So what's the tension point between those two things? And I suspect that while there are arguments to be made that we could regress, that evolution in and of itself is not always a march towards progress. There's some things that evolved out of necessity that is maybe not necessarily something that you could consider to be progress, but is just sort of a byproduct of whatever necessity of the time period or like the, whatever's happening in a certain animal's experience of their environment for a time. I do think that if you chart human history and civilizations and societies, while there are mysteries like how did Egyptians know what sperm looked like, for the most part, I think that we are getting kinder to each other as humans. Like they might have had pieces of esoteric knowledge that we don't really understand, and maybe they had access to technologies that made them superior in some way, potentially. I don't know. But as we look at civilizations over time, I mean, basically the march of world powers, a lot of times, I mean, with the exceptions of like the Greeks that respected Egypt, the Egyptians and made sure that they preserved their temples and stuff, there's a lot of world powers or even just colonies or whatever that once they took over a place, they would just level those people groups. Like nobody existed anymore. And they would destroy entire tribes and destroy all their stuff. I mean, there are people groups that we don't really know existed because it was not uncommon to, as Conan the Barbarian said, to drive your enemies before you and hear the lamentations of their women. It's like you just destroy them. And in the modern world, we don't do that as much. There are places on the planet right now that are doing that to each other, and we don't consider them evolved. We don't consider them at the top, the forefront of social progress or progression. So it does appear that as time goes and as our technologies advance and as we get more sophisticated in some of these ways, we do get nicer to each other as a general rule. It does seem that we're getting nicer. Actually, maybe even to a point where I would say right now we're almost too nice. Like we're very soft and we can't handle very much. We're so far removed away from sort of like the survival component of being human and what it actually takes to survive. We've gotten to a place that's so cushy. Like sometimes I worry that the cushiness is the thing that's going to take us down. But as long as we don't get too soft, right? Like as long as we keep some resistance, some emotional and psychological resilience, as long as we do that, it does appear as if we could evolve to a place where maybe the future would look like, I don't know, like Star Trek, right? Where we boldly go discover stuff because most of the problems that we're experiencing on Earth have been solved and taken care of. Who knows? And I think that one of the ideas of inspiring people to be the best versions of themselves is that we don't need everybody to be there. We just need enough people to be there. We don't need every single human being on the planet working on themselves because most people are not that influential and never will be. They're the beneficiaries of other influential people. And if we can get a message out of doing better and becoming the best version of yourself, one, your own life improves, right? You minimize your pain and you maximize your pleasure as an individual, which might be the name of the game anyway. But I think on an impact level, while I don't believe any one person has the capacity to save the world, I do think that a collective group of people, or like maybe a tipping point percentage of people that are being innovative and thinking in more compassionate ways, but also in ways that actually, truly influence progress. You've got enough of those people and they spearhead and drag everybody else along into a better future. And so there's no way any individual can make the impact that will truly save everything. Like you go in and you start trying to save Cairo and it's just not going to happen. Like Cairo is going to evolve the way that Cairo needs to evolve to recover from whatever it needed to recover from and to get back into a time period of glory days if it ever had been or whatever. But there are ways to influence groups of people, say in Cairo, to do better and to maybe create enough pressure or mobilization forward to ultimately drag other people with them, and then the lifestyle of everybody improves, because as you've mentioned multiple times, Joel, the rising tide raises all ships. So there's this sort of modesty, I think, that has been a big part of the lesson that I came home with. This concept of modesty, meaning that don't buy your own bullshit too much. Don't think of yourself as the person who's going to like save the world or the planet. You're just not that cool. You're kind of an insignificant speck of dust in the universe, and it won't remember you after you're gone. All right.
This is you talking to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and actually, to everybody else too. To me, but it starts with me, right? I'm talking to myself here. Don't buy your own bullshit too much. Don't get too conceited in how you see all this panning out. Like you're made of stardust, and you'll go back to being stardust, and that's pretty much it. And at the same time, you can have a life where you're trying. And maybe if you try well enough and you do a good job and you take intrinsic reward from the attempt and from trying, maybe you and a group of like-minded individuals that are also trying might have enough force of positivity so that you just drag everybody else with you as you mobilize towards a better future. And that's entirely possible. And I think that that's a noble thing to try. Like, I think it's good to try. And it's important not to get too whipped up by everything that's going on around you, because it's hard to try. It's hard to be the best version of yourself if you're constantly, like, say, in the drama triangle, where you're constantly looking for villains and seeing yourself as a hero and looking for victims, or seeing yourself as a victim and looking for heroes, or whatever it is. So yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm most grateful to for our experience is coming back with like sort of a sense of humility and modesty, and an understanding of my relative place in the universe. So that was me talking a lot. I just went on like a little lecture. What do you think is the biggest thing that you took away from Egypt?
I think the message of leadership kept rolling in my head a lot, and this idea of looking at past leaders. Like, we have monuments to some of the most ancient leaders on the planet, which were the original pharaohs, like from a long time ago. We have pyramids, 5,000-year-old pyramids that leadership developed and put there. And this idea of legacy came through, this idea of leading and legacy and messaging. Like, there's a message encoded in some of these structures. Someone led the charge to create things. Now, these were tombs and designed more for the afterlife. And I don't necessarily believe in the afterlife, like in a metaphysical way. I don't not believe in it, but I don't necessarily believe in it. And yet they achieved almost an afterlife element by creating these structures that we're still talking about 5,000 years later. In some ways, these pharaohs still live on with the leadership they provided and the structures they built and the messaging they baked in there. It's very interesting to me to see such a long timeline of influence and leadership. And this one idea struck me when I was in Egypt. A lot of the narratives swell around or circle around the idea of a pharaoh of the ancient times uniting Upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt, with Lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt. And it was the uniting of these two kingdoms that was celebrated. And it was something that was profound for the people of the time. And it was the greatest civilization on earth that we know of at that time when this was happening. Now, there were other civilizations springing up, I think, in Asia, Chinese civilizations, and I think the Incas and the Mayas in South America. So there's, around the same time period, but the Egyptians are some of the earliest.
Yeah, they all came later, though.
Yeah. And so just seeing this message of unification and a kingdom that was a message to the region, to the area, that we're going to be united and stronger together than separate, and the leadership that made that happen. And I thought, what if Cairo and Egypt could have that same messaging today? What if a visionary leader sprung up from Egypt that could say, we were the original civilization that brought people together, kingdoms when they were smaller, maybe we can have influence in the world and bringing the world together. They're in a really interesting location in the world where they're in the Middle East. They're at a crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, Europe. They're on the Mediterranean. It's very near the cradle of civilization. It is one of the most ancient civilizations ever. So I had a lot of these messages running through my mind of what would happen if somebody that was a native Egyptian that had leadership qualities that could rise up with a really interesting vision for what Egypt could be, not for itself only, but what it could set the tone for the entire planet as being the historians and the stewards of some of our ancient artifacts, messaging, and history. Like, what would happen if they took that rich resource and turned that into a narrative and cast that narrative for the entire planet? So these are the themes that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was there, is what would it take to identify leadership that could do that, help augment them and give them the material resource and help them cast a vision in the messaging for the rest of the world to catch a vision. Because I think people would listen. I think people, if you have something that ancient, I think if you had a visionary leader that could speak to that, people would look over there and go, there are things there, there's wisdom there that is ancient that we as humans can learn from. And I think Egypt has some of the best opportunities to be global leaders on the planet.
We almost came up with different, like almost diametrically opposed messages, where I was like you're an insignificant piece of stardust. Don't get all uppity and think you can make any progress or change. And you got you got an inspiration of like, what would it take to be the kind of leader that could have a message? Like, how could you be a person, an individual that could make major change, not just locally, but also globally? If you were positioned, if you had like the initial conditions of being positioned next to something that captures the world's attention and imagination, like something like the pyramids. I find that interesting that you and I had almost very different, but you know what? What's interesting is I don't think they're contradictory. They're very different. They almost sound contradictory, but I don't think they are. I think there's a tension in between these two things, which is what is the attitude you have to start out with to become the kind of person you're talking about? Do you have to be a person who believes, like has almost like a messiah complex and believes that it is your job to save the planet and save the world in order to be the kind of person who has that message? Or do you have to understand your relative place in the universe and realize that any changes that you're making are just temporary changes that are hitting the timeline of your place in history and can make a positive change? But like you're talking about the pharaoh that unified Upper and Lower Egypt, like that wasn't forever. I mean, it did in the sense that now we have like territory lines around all of Egypt, like that's the territory line of the country. But it's not like it necessarily like saved the planet. So I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting back and forth. I'm thinking about it more. I'm like sort of trying to figure out the tension point between those two things.
Yeah, and there's probably well-positioned cities and people groups all over the world that have opportunities to take the lead on things. And being in Egypt, I saw the opportunity Egyptians have and the leadership of Egypt would have to help cast a vision for what the world could be. And they may not take up the mantle. They may never aspire to that. Maybe that's not something they're interested in. But when I was there, that's the vision I saw of what was possible for the Egyptian people. And I think that maybe somebody else, another people group, another leadership structure is able to do that in a different way somewhere else on the planet. I don't know. There's different cultures and people that we all tend to look to at different times. Right now, it seems like Hollywood has a lot of influence in the world. The Marvel movies that come out of the Disney studios on a global scale are some of the most visited or watched movies on the planet. What if Hollywood, instead of, protesting and figuring all this like stupid lower level politics stuff out, what if they got a vision for casting what the world could be in a more positive way and cast a vision for how we could be as people and started making films and media that spoke to people and enlightened them and helped them see something that was possible, that was better than what we've had before, or other places. So these are the themes that were rolling in my head is what would it take to message to the world to help us, if we do care about humanity, if we do see any significance at all in us being human, what could we do to message on a global scale that would help move the ball forward and improve people's lives, even a small percentage in some ways? And I think that is something that I think a lot about, regardless of where I'm at or what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope it doesn't sound too much like I've like got all nihilistic and I'm going through some sort of existential crisis, acknowledging my insignificance in the universe. But I actually...
Is this your Nietzsche phase?
Yeah, it's my Nietzsche phase. No, I actually do feel like... I agree with you, though. Like, I agree that there is an energy in Egypt that makes you understand what's possible.
Well, and they were telling us, Hassan, who was taking us around, we were talking about how many different cultures have come in, all the way back to invaders from different countries. I mean, the Greeks and the British and different people groups have come in to try to kind of take over Egypt. And the comment of Egyptians is we tend to take over the people that try to take us over. Like Egypt gets into them more than they get into Egypt in a way. And Egypt's been rich with natural resources and historical resources and all of the things that it has there that other cultures and people have come to take or to take for themselves. And it really hasn't worked out for them. Like the Egyptians still have that in their possession in a lot of ways. Like the British are gone, right? They were there for a long time, but they're not really, there's some influence there. But they even drive on the right side of the road. And I said, wait, the British were so influential here. Why didn't you end up driving your cars on the left side? They said, because the Egyptians just can't be influenced that much. Like we just do our thing that we're going to do. And the British just didn't get the cars driving on the left side of the road like other British colonies like South Africa, Jamaica, Australia, wherever else. They would be following the British model of driving on the left side. They don't do that in Egypt. They drive on the right side of the road like we do here in America. So it's really interesting to see how cultures haven't really been able to get their hooks in and change Egypt for the way they wanted to shape it in their image, which I thought was also interesting. There's a resilience to the people there. There's a resilience to the longevity of what has been there for so long that hasn't been able to be messed with in some ways. One of the cool things that happened near the end of the trip was we were able to connect with Dr. Beatrice Chestnut and Aranio Pius, who were actually over there teaching a Enneagram workshop. They were attending an Enneagram conference with a bunch of Enneagram leadership and thought leaders actually in Cairo. There is a growing presence for the Enneagram and personality systems there. So we went over to a place called the Field of Awakening where it was near Giza, or I was in Giza, I think, the 6th of October area near Giza. And we saw Beatrice, we got to connect with her and watch her and Aranio teach a little bit about the Enneagram. And we connected with some people on the ground who were telling us that in the corporate world in Cairo right now, the Myers-Briggs system is on the rise as well. Not just the Enneagram system and spiritual practice and all that, but all of a sudden companies have attuned themselves to the Myers-Briggs system, and there's personality systems now being used in the corporate workforces of Cairo, which I thought was really interesting. So we made some connection with this really interesting school. They have a house or a villa there where they're holding workshops around neurolinguistic programming, family constellations, Enneagram, personal growth workshops. So that was a really cool experience to see that. And our guide who was with us, Hassan, our friend who was taking us around, got to come experience that as well. He's Egyptian. He said, I didn't know this even existed in Cairo. This is so cool. People are working on these things. And there's this growing sense of personal growth and these systems and learnings that are coming to Cairo I was unaware of. So he was really excited to connect with him as well and potentially take some classes there. So I think there's some things that are happening in Cairo that are exciting, and Egypt in general, that are, as the next few years go on, we're going to see some exciting things coming out of Cairo. And I see it as an important city. It's the 15th largest city on the planet. I think it's an important location. It's the largest city in the Middle East. It is well positioned on the continent of Africa, but very close to two other continents of Europe and Asia. And I think it can be a very interesting city going forward for the Islamic world, the Arabic world, and just that part of the world in general.
Yeah, we might end up back in Giza in Cairo to do some, some type-based stuff. We'll see. I think Egypt is kind of gotten into me too. Like I would love to go back. I would love to go back for some sort of official capacity, as well as exploring even more of the terrain. I hope I wasn't too depressing in my whole what I took away from Egypt.
I'm insignificant. Nothing matters. Life is just like the sand of the desert. It'll just be washed away or blown away in 2 minutes.
I think, I think the reason why that ended up striking me is that I feel like everywhere I turn, there's a drama triangle going on. Just in general, like I see it in the media. I mean, the media, of course, that's their bread and butter. They make their money off of the drama triangle. Whoever they can villainize, whoever they can victimize, whoever, or like create into a victim, however they can heroize or victimize, turn themselves into a victim or whatever. Like that's how they make their money, is getting you involved in the soap opera of whatever's happening. And so because that's the noise that we get the most of, it gets embedded into who we are. And then we start replicating this drama triangle all over the place as well. And I think I'm at a place where I feel like the leverage point is remembering that every drama triangle that we create is 100% an invention of our minds. Like it never is that simple. It's always more complicated. The systems have way more nodes in them than we like to believe. And one of the nodes in every system that should at least be taken into consideration, particularly if you're letting yourself constantly and perpetually be pulled into a drama triangle. And right now, it is everywhere. The drama triangle is a cacophony of noise around me at all times, particularly, again, represented in the media around politics and around celebrities and around, like, who's the bad guy now or whatever. I think the node in every system of the impermanence of what's going on, that time is very long. It doesn't really care. It's completely indifferent to all of us, and it will continue passing on long after we're here. I think it's it's a node of perspective that I have forgotten to include in every system I look at. And so I think it's more like I'm going to keep my finger on the pulse of that node. I'm going to remember whenever I get all wound up or thinking, something, this is an injustice, or shaking my angry fist at the world, or whatever it is, it's got me all hot and bothered about the scandal du jour. I think I'm just going to really remember that node of, and it kind of doesn't matter. It kind of doesn't matter. It only matters as much as I'm going to let it matter in this moment. It was a very liberating thought, actually. So I know it probably sounded depressing and like I'm going off on some sort of existential crisis place of depression, but it was a really liberating thought. I think it was actually a relief to think about it. And so, yeah, I think that that's why it was my takeaway. It wasn't actually a bad thing. It was actually a good thing.
I think I had a similar experience when we were at, I think it was the Karnak temple, and I saw the Coptic Christians that had come through in the early centuries, the first, second century, and they had set up shop. They had actually chiseled away some of the Egyptian carvings on the walls because it was pagan in their minds. The Coptic Christians saw it as pagan, so they chipped it away. And I realized, as much as I see the permanence and the structural longevity of the temples that are in Egypt and the pyramids, a people group can come right after and destroy something that was really preserved and worked hard for. The impermanence of even very permanent things, stone structures, became very apparent to me. This fleeting nature of everything. And history's kind of written not just by the winners, but also by the current people that own, history's owned by us today, right? A sense of the past is owned by us right now. In 100 years, those people 100 years from now will own history. We don't get to own it. We can write down whatever we want, and we can build as many structures as we want, and we can carve as many things in the walls and make a body of work and all this important stuff that we think is super important. And 1 or 2 generations away can go, I don't care, and toss it to the side or desecrate it or remove it.
Well, and that's inevitable, actually.
Yeah.
Every person who thinks that they're working for justice and good right now is going to be demonized in the future as being basically a troglodyte. There's nothing that we can do that will not seem to be in some way interpreted, negatively in the future. If you believe that you are on the side of right, the future will see you on the side of wrong in some way.
Yeah, and so I think that's something that I really took away too, as well as the leadership thing, is this idea of it's nothing is even things that seem permanent. Eventually those pyramids that are 5,000 years old will either erode or be destroyed or something. They're not going to last forever, maybe another 5,000 years, but eventually things just will wear out. Things just don't last forever. Nothing lasts for eternity. And so I think that was really profound too. It was a sense of timeline I really came away with.
Yeah.
This really long timeline.
Yeah.
That I was starting to see, like an abstract version of. It's hard to explain, but it's a sense of nothing is permanent, and yet there are things that are worth preserving that are as permanent as we can have them. Like the pyramids are important to preserve because they're the most permanent type of thing we have. And yet even they're not permanent. So it's just this weird juxtaposition of the permanence and impermanence of things at the same time.
Yeah, and the desire to make things as good as possible right now that we can. Like I think that's a good game to play. I think trying to make things better and more positive is a good game. And also remembering it's just the game we're choosing to play.
So what about you? Have you had international travel or local travel, regional travel that's really changed your perspective on things? Have you seen other people groups and cultures? Have you experienced things viscerally and that's opened your eyes or made you see something different or think about something different? We'd love you to share your story over at personalityhacker.com directly below this show. It'd be great to get a conversation started about some of the insights maybe that you could bring to the table to this conversation. You've been here with us, but you haven't had a microphone. So now's your time to come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Ask your question, leave a comment, or share your story, which would be really cool to hear from you.
And if I didn't scare you away too much with my nihilistic streak and you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. We had a person write in and said, I didn't know you guys created programs. And I was like, really? Because that's how we do everything we do is by you going and getting a program. So if you want to help sponsor us and invest in yourself and keep this podcast going, you should go to personalityhacker.com and look under our programs and products and see if there is a personal development course that is right for you. You can start out with a personality type starter kit, which is designed to help you optimize your personality type as we talk about. So go over to personalityhacker.com and check out one of our programs and see if one is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.